Welcome to lesson 4 on Frankenstein. Today we are going to look at the way that men and women are presented in the first 2 chapters of Victor Frankenstein's narrative. You know what that means. I would like you, before you go any further, to pause and to read chapter 1 and chapter 2 and have a pen in your hand taking notes. How do you think men and women are presented? Hopefully your notes look something a little like mine. If they do, then we can crack on. A quick summary to begin with. In chapter 1, Victor Frankenstein begins his narrative. He starts with his family background, his birth and early childhood, telling Walton, because of course all of this is being told in the Arctic Circle, about his father Alphonse and his mother Caroline. Alphonse became Caroline's protector when her father, Alphonse's longtime friend Beaufort, died in poverty. They married 2 years later and Victor was born soon after. Frankenstein then describes how his childhood companion, Elizabeth Lavenza, entered his family. While visiting a poor Italian family, Caroline notices a beautiful blonde girl among the dark-haired Italian children. Upon discovering that Elizabeth is the orphan daughter of a Milanese nobleman and a German woman, and that the Italian family can barely afford to feed her, Caroline adopts Elizabeth and brings her back to Geneva. Victor's mother decides at the moment of the adoption that Elizabeth and Victor should someday marry. In chapter 2, Elizabeth and Victor grow up together as best friends. Victor also develops a friendship with Henry Clerval, a schoolmate of his, and his childhood is basically happily surrounded by a close domestic circle. As a teenager, he becomes increasingly interested in science, and especially the occult sciences of Cornelius Agrippa, a 16th century writer and scientist. The occult refers to dark, mysterious, kind of hoodoo-voodoo, pseudoscience. The other major event of chapter 2 involves him discovering the destructive power of nature when, during a raging storm, lightning destroys a tree near his house. A modern natural philosopher accompanying the Frankenstein family explains to Victor the workings of electricity, making the ideas of the alchemists, Cornelius Agrippa and Paracelsus, seem outdated and worthless. The change in narrative perspective from Captain Walton to Frankenstein is an abrupt one. We move from the foreign, dangerous, exotic environment of the Arctic Circle to a far more comfortable, middle-class Geneva of Frankenstein's childhood. It feels like we've moved from some kind of adventure story into an example of 19th century domestic or sentimental fiction. Shelley uses this juxtaposition to create an uneasiness in her reader, and perhaps this sets up the novel's later use of what Freud would have called the uncanny. The juxtaposition also shows us that the events of the novel could easily be taking place in the real world, our world. This is not a fantasy removed from our own lives. This change in setting also allows Shelley to continue to explore some of the key themes that she established in Captain Walton's letters. Number 1, the passivity of women. Frankenstein's mother, Caroline Beaufort, is depicted as angelic. On the one hand, this establishes her as a caricature of passive femininity. She embodies all of the virtues that 19th century women were expected to conform to. She's demure, innocent, uncorrupted by worldly experience. It's interesting to pause and reflect on the literary context in which Mary Shelley was writing Frankenstein. Women had been writers before the 19th century. In fact, you might want to go and look up Aphra Behn, for example, if you don't already know about her work. But around 1800, women novelists were at the head of a major cultural moment. We now consider Mary Shelley as one of the most influential writers of the period, but she was writing in the shadow of another famous female writer, Jane Austen. Austen is known for her satirical novels, which poke fun at the upper middle class and their manners. In these novels we see men and women concerned with going to balls, dancing, wearing frock coats and, most importantly, getting married. But while Austen explored her fair share of female stereotypes, she also created powerfully independent, intellectual female characters and narrative voices. Elizabeth Bennet in Pride and Prejudice is perhaps the most famous of these examples. Written in 1813, Mary Shelley would have been aware of Pride and Prejudice, and so would have had some knowledge of this radical way that Austen was depicting women. This, in particular, because Jane Austen was heavily indebted to Mary Shelley's mother, Mary Wollstonecraft, and her thinking. In this literary context, is Caroline Beaufort, Victor's mother's presentation as a passive woman, a satire of the way that women used to be perceived? Or is Shelley deliberately ignoring the fashion for independent female characters introduced by Austen 5 years before, maybe for another reason? Victor also describes his mother as angelic, and this establishes an important role that women play in the novel. It foreshadows that women are present in the narrative to die. Shelley contributed to the forming of a cliché of the Gothic genre by doing this. Think about all the Gothic stories you know of. Usually the women are there to play the role of the victim. They are there to die. In these chapters, Victor also introduces us to his cousin Elizabeth. In the 1818 version of the novel, the first draft, Victor and Elizabeth were cousins by blood. And even though quite a few cousins got married in the 19th century without too much stigma, by 1831, in the second draft of the novel, and the second publication of the novel, Shelley changed this so that they were no longer related by blood. In fact, Elizabeth was, as we've already discussed, a child in an Italian village who was adopted. Elizabeth is Victor's love interest. His mother decides that they are destined to marry each other, in a moment which is in fact quite like a mother in one of Jane Austen's novels, her only role being to get her children married off. Victor describes her as his more than sister, the beautiful and adored companion of all of his occupations and his pleasures. Here, Elizabeth is used as a kind of prop to Victor's characterisation, revealing two important things about him. Firstly, in his early life and childhood, he was clearly capable of forming normal human attachments to other people. This is important to remember when we later see him descend into madness and isolation after creating his creature. Secondly, there is a hint that he has an almost obsessive, absolutist personality. He doesn't seem to do things by half measure. This extreme attachment to Elizabeth in childhood mirrors his extreme pursuit of knowledge and later his extreme chasing after the creature he creates. In this way, Shelley is foreshadowing an interesting debate which crops up later in the novel, what we might today call the nature-nurture debate. The question she asks is, are we born with our major characteristics, abilities and features already determined, already in place? Or do these things depend a bit more on the experiences that we go through, perhaps the experiences we endure in life? In terms of his obsessive personality, at least, Frankenstein was clearly born with that capacity inbuilt, just as Elizabeth, in her turn, seems to have been born pure and innocent. Women are depicted as passive or angelic. Men are depicted as compulsive. Another important aspect of Shelley's depiction of Frankenstein's early life is the way that she establishes he grew up in blissful comfort. He was loved and looked after. This is the kind of life which would be anathema to romantic thinking. The romantic writers and thinkers saw value in struggle and conflict. Victor doesn't seem to experience any of this in early childhood. According to the Romantics, comfort leads to a kind of stagnation, to an intellectual laziness and complacency. So it doesn't surprise us that, from chapter 2 onwards, Victor seems to seek out conflict. One example would be his return to the outdated scientists Paracelsus and Cornelius Agrippa. He could accept the comfortable truth that their science has been disproved and disregarded, but instead he grapples with them, trying to find some kind of deeper truth in them. This struggle, or as the German romantic Goethe would have called it, Strebend, is established by Shelley as another typically male characteristic. So this is the question that you are now going to write an essay in response to. How does Shelley depict different roles for men and women in chapters 1 and 2 of the novel? Here are the success criteria that I would like you to pay attention to. You need to make an argument about the respective roles of men and women in the novel. You need to, of course, use evidence from both chapter 1 and 2. Your explanation should make reference to social, historical, and the literary context. Your analysis needs to focus on Mary Shelley's chosen techniques, that's language, structure, and form. And finally, you should try to make links to Shelley's presentation of men and women in other parts of the novel. Yes, you could start with Walton's letters at the start, but why not make links to further on later in the novel? There's nothing stopping you reading ahead. In the next part of the novel, we see it becoming a science fiction story. Victor explores the work of Cornelius Agrippa and Paracelsus, and it leads him down a slippery slope to his hubristic experimentation.